obviously in the UK and the EU itself, they are stepping up enforcement in the last 2 to 3 months. If we'd had this conversation in July or August, I'd have said to you, look, people are abusing the system, people are finding loopholes, and the regulators aren't doing anything about it. We are seeing that firsthand. In the last 2 months, the regulators have really stepped up the enforcement.
What sanctions currently are being applied by the West on Russia?
Morning, Rosie. Hope you can hear me okay. So that's I could probably take up all your radio show discussing what sanctions have been applied. But typically, given that Russia is such a major exporter of commodities, and when I say commodities, oil, gas, coal, that's typically where the sanctions have been concentrated on, because that's the lifeblood of the Russian economy, its ability to export those major commodities globally, and historically exporting those commodities to the West, primarily Europe, a little bit to the UK, not so much to the States. But by and large, the sanctions have concentrated on restricting those exports of energy, basically.
And to what extent have they hurt the Russian economy sufficiently that they would hurt the pockets of Russians?
Yeah, so it's a very interesting question, and I think the reality is they have had an impact. I think it would be foolish to dismiss them and say there's been no impact. I think realistically, with any sanctions, it's all about enforcement. So there's some really interesting figures about the impact of sanctions, and particularly if you look at Russia's oil exports. So there's pretty much a blanket ban on exports of Russian crude now into Europe, into the UK, and certainly to the US, which has an impact. But the reality is they kick in if they're enforced. So a large part of these sanctions were brought in earlier this year, so January time. So you see a marked drop off in terms of export revenues from oil in the first quarter of 2023, quite significant, because that's when the sanctions came into force, and obviously people took them very seriously. I think the problem is, as time has passed, people get more comfortable with the sanctions. They get more comfortable that the enforcement isn't as tight as it should be.
Sorry, when you say people, do you mean the countries imposing the sanctions?
The people that they would apply to. So whilst there are restrictions in place, Russian crude can still be exported to certain countries outside the EU. So the Chinese, Turkey, example, countries outside the EU. But there are limitations on the price that the oil can be purchased for. And I think the problem is, as time has passed, people simply just get more comfortable with it. People abuse the systems. People find loopholes, and it's quite interesting because the revenues from Russia have then increased as the years gone by, as people get more comfortable with it. Now,
And Russia's become
I think
more
what needs to happen
flexible.
next. Yeah, agreed. And they find other trading partners. They find other avenues to move their products. That's just the commercial world we live in. But I think what needs to happen, I think, to be fair to the regulators, and when I say the regulators, I mean the OFACs of this world, obviously in the UK and the EU itself, they are stepping up enforcement in the last 2 to 3 months. If we'd had this conversation in July or August, I'd have said to you, look, people are abusing the system, people are finding loopholes, and the regulators aren't doing anything about it. We are seeing that firsthand. In the last 2 months, the regulators have really stepped up the enforcement.
James, thank you so much for giving us just a small insight into all those processes and how, with the best of intentions, these sanctions can be laid down. And then with time, how that's warped slightly. James Willn, thank you, partner at the international law firm Reed Smith, who advises on sanction-related issues.